The house was too quiet. Not peaceful, just wrong. It was the kind of silence that made a person aware of every little sound, every shift in the air, every breath drawn too sharply. The night outside was restless, the wind pushing through the trees in uneven bursts, whispering against the old wooden walls as if carrying voices too faint to understand. Inside, the flickering candlelight cast jittery shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls, moving as if they had a life of their own. Sitting by the window, the lone figure stared out at the dense forest that surrounded the property. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches swaying ever so slightly, though the air felt still. The deeper they gazed into the blackness between the trunks, the more it seemed to shift, as though something just beyond the reach of sight was moving between them. An unshakable feeling settled into their chest, a feeling of being watched. Then, creak. A single deliberate groan of wood came from behind, somewhere in the hallway. It was the unmistakable sound of weight pressing down on an old floorboard, their breath hitched, body going rigid. The room seemed to shrink around them as they listened, straining to hear past the pounding of their own heartbeat. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no rustling, just the thick, waiting silence. Tap. The quiet shattered as a picture frame on the shelf toppled forward, crashing face down onto the floor. The sound sent a sharp jolt through their body, and they spun toward it, pulse hammering. The frame lay motionless, the glass unbroken, but something about its fall felt deliberate. The air in the room had changed. It was no longer warm and still, no longer normal. It had taken on a weight, a coldness that pressed against their skin, creeping into their bones. The candle flickered erratically, struggling against an invisible force. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. Then, bang. A violent jarring noise exploded from outside, cutting through the silence like a blade. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something heavy, something deliberate. Their breath caught in their throat, and for a moment they sat frozen, gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that their knuckles turned white. Their eyes flickered back to the window, to the deep blackness beyond the trees. The night stared back. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The question clawed at their mind. Should they go and check or wait for it to come to them? The night air was colder than expected, biting against their skin as they stepped onto the porch. The candle light from inside barely reached the yard, leaving most of the world swallowed in darkness. The forest loomed ahead, an endless wall of twisted trees that seemed to lean closer, their skeletal branches shifting even though the air was still. The quiet had a presence, heavy, suffocating. The wind had died completely, yet the trees moved. Each step forward felt like stepping into something unseen, something watching. The night pressed against them, thick with an unnatural stillness. The distant whispers they had heard inside the house had not faded. If anything, they had grown sharper, more distinct, threading through the air like something unseen was calling, beckoning. Then they saw it. Half buried in the dirt near the tree line lay something small, pale and out of place. $1. It was old, its porcelain face cracked down the center, as if it had been dropped from a great height. Its dress, once white, was now stained with dirt and something darker, something they didn't want to name. But the worst part, the part that sent a deep, slow shiver through their spine, was its eyes. Or rather, the absence of them. The sockets gaped empty, black holes where painted irises should have been. Their instinct screamed, "Leave it alone." But their hands moved anyway. Fingers brushed against the cold porcelain, and a faint chill crawled up their arm. They picked it up. It was wrong. Not just broken. Not just abandoned. It felt wrong, as though something had been inside it once, and now it was waiting. They turned back toward the house. The whispers followed. Inside, the warmth of the candle should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The house no longer felt like a place of safety. The doll sat on the table, still and silent. Yet something about its posture seemed different, as if it had shifted ever so slightly. They stared at it, heart pounding. It was ridiculous. Dolls didn't move. It had been their imagination. Tap. A sound, barely a noise at all, but it made their breath hitch. A soft shift, like fabric against wood. Their eyes snapped back to the doll. It hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't, but their chest felt tight, their skin prickling with unease. Outside, the whispers grew louder. No longer just noise, no longer distant. The words were impossible to make out, but they carried an unmistakable shape now. A voice. And it was calling their name. Then from upstairs, footsteps, slow, measured. They froze. No one else lived in the house. The steps did not stop. The whispers followed them now. They had tried to ignore them, to pretend they were nothing more than tricks of the mind, but they never stopped. At first, they had been distant like the wind shifting through the trees. Now they were closer, inside the house. No matter where they went, they could hear them, threading through the walls, slipping beneath the doors, curling around their ears like unseen fingers. And then the house began to change. Doors slammed shut on their own, loud enough to shake the walls. Lights flickered, objects moved, not in an obvious dramatic way, but subtly, just enough to make them doubt reality. A chair an inch to the left, a book lying open when it had been closed, the doll always sitting where they had left it, yet somehow never quite in the same position. Worst of all were the mirrors. At first they avoided looking into them. A primal fear told them not to. But some things were unavoidable. A fleeting glance while brushing past, an accidental catch of their reflection. And each time, something was wrong. Their reflection lingered a second too long when they looked away. Shadows moved in the glass that weren't in the room. Once, late at night, they swore they saw something standing behind them. A figure, black and shapeless, watching. When they turned, the room was empty. They stopped looking after that. One night, as they paced the study, trying to force themselves to believe everything was in their head, their fingers brushed against the bookshelf. A soft, mechanical click echoed through the room, and before they could react, the shelf shifted, revealing a hidden passage. Their heart pounded. It was a narrow staircase, spiraling downward into darkness. A damp, earthy smell drifted up mixed with something old and metallic. Fear gripped them, telling them to turn back, to seal the passage and forget it existed. But curiosity, something deeper, something they couldn't fight, drew them forward. The stairs creaked beneath their weight, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were lined with symbols, ancient carvings that pulsed with something wrong, something alive. The deeper they went, the stronger the whispers became. Not just sound now, but voices, overlapping, urgent, desperate. They couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Turn back, turn back, turn back. They reached the bottom. The basement was small, barely more than a stone chamber. the walls slick with moisture. The air was heavy, pressing against their skin like unseen hands. In the farthest corner sat an old wooden chest, its surface scarred and blackened with age. The sight of it sent a slow, crawling dread through their veins. They stepped forward. The whispers screamed. Hands trembling, they lifted the lid. Inside was a journal, its pages brittle, ink faded. The writing was frantic, uneven, as though penned by a shaking hand. They turned the pages, their breath catching as the story unfolded. A curse, a terrible, ancient debt tied to their bloodline, bound to the forest, and a warning, never take what belongs to it. Their vision blurred. The doll. A scream shattered the silence. It came from upstairs. Heart hammering, they turned and ran, taking the stairs two at a time. The house felt different, colder, watching. The scream had stopped, replaced by suffocating silence. They reached their bedroom. The door was open, and there, sitting on the bed, perfectly still, the doll, staring straight at them. The pool of the forest was relentless. It had always been there, lingering at the edges of their thoughts, a quiet presence pressing against their mind. But now it was impossible to ignore. It whispered to them in the dead of night, in the silent moments between breaths. It wanted them. By the time the sun set, they had made up their mind. They stuffed a flashlight into their bag, pulled on a jacket, and stepped outside. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The house loomed behind them, but it felt like nothing more than an afterthought now. Their real destination lay ahead, beyond the gnarled tree line. The moment they crossed into the forest, the world changed. The air was thicker, heavier. The trees, ancient and twisted, stretched high above them, their branches interwoven like skeletal fingers. The deeper they walked, the stranger everything became. The ground beneath their feet was soft, not like damp soil, but something unnatural, something that gave slightly with each step like flesh. Then came the laughter. It was faint at first, just a distant echo threading through the trees. Children laughing, high-pitched, playful, but wrong, like a recording played just slightly off-key. They stopped, scanning the dark spaces between the trunks. No one was there. A gust of wind passed through the trees, or maybe it was a whisper. They pressed on. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled upon something unexpected. A circle of stones, each one carved with strange, ancient symbols. The markings were deep, jagged, as if carved in a frenzy. The air around them pulsed with an invisible force, something old and watching. Then they saw it. Behind the stones, a figure stood. It was tall and wrong, its form swallowed by shadows. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply watched. A slow, creeping dread spread through their chest, replacing curiosity with pure, suffocating panic. They took a step back. The figure stepped forward. The flashlight flickered. They turned and ran. Branches clawed at them. Roots curled around their ankles. The whispers turned to screams. Overlapping voices shrieking words they couldn't understand. The flashlight flickered again. And then, darkness. Everything went silent, and something breathed behind them. The forest seemed to close in around them, its oppressive silence pressing against their ears, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Their legs felt heavy with fatigue, but they couldn't stop. The pull towards something deeper, something darker, had become too strong to resist. Then they saw it, a cabin, half hidden among the thick trees, barely noticeable against the shadows. Its roof sagged under the weight of years, and the walls were darkened with moss and decay. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But the closer they got, the more a strange sense of dread seeped into their chest. Something felt wrong about it, like it had been waiting. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, and they stepped inside. The air was stale, musty, and thick with the scent of rot. At first, all seemed still, but as their eyes adjusted to the dimness, they saw it, the walls, streaked with old dried blood. The red stains were faint, but they were unmistakable. They traced chaotic patterns, like desperate, frenzied attempts to escape. On a table near the center of the room lay a diary. The leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age, but something about it seemed too recent, too personal. They picked it up with trembling hands. The first entry was written hastily, almost frantically. "I don't know how much longer I can stay. The curse is real. The forest is alive, and it won't let me go. I tried to leave, but it won't let me. It knows. It's always watching." The words sent a chill down their spine. Their eyes darted around the room. The whispers, they were still there. Louder now, almost as though they were coming from the walls themselves. A scratching sound broke through the stillness. It came from beneath the floorboards. A slow, deliberate scraping. Something was moving. Something trapped below. They stepped back, the hairs on the back of their neck standing up. The diary fell from their hands, landing with a soft thud on the wooden floor. Bang! The sound was so sudden, it made them jump. The scratching continued, and the floor creaked ominously. Without thinking, their hands shot to the edge of the nearest floorboard. They ripped it free, revealing a small gap beneath it. Something shifted in the darkness below. Swallowing their fear, they dropped to their knees and peered into the darkened space beneath the cabin. The flashlight flickered before it finally held steady, casting a dim light into the opening. What they saw made their stomach turn. A tunnel, dark and narrow, stretching deep into the earth. There were no answers here. But something was calling, and it was deeper. They hesitated only a moment before lowering themselves into the hole. The tunnel was cold, the walls slick with moisture. The air was thick with the stench of decay. As they crawled forward, the ground beneath them gave with a sickening squelch, like stepping on something soft and unnatural. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every inch they moved, and the air felt heavier, denser, like it was pushing back, forcing them to turn around. But there was no going back now. Every step, every crawl was filled with strange, grotesque sights. Bones, the bones of animals, scattered across the floor in piles, broken and twisted in unnatural positions. They moved forward, and more appeared, filling the space around them. Their hearts raced, each crack of bone underfoot like a warning. Claw marks, deep, jagged gouges marred the tunnel walls, some fresh, others old, as though someone had tried to escape. The deeper they went, the more the walls seemed to whisper. Words indistinct, overlapping voices, fragments of sentences that filled the space like a swarm of flies buzzing just beyond hearing. And then they reached it. At the very end of the tunnel stood a door. It was old, made of dark wood, the edges worn and scarred. But it was the pulsing that caught their attention. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but as they drew closer, it became undeniable. The door was alive, its surface undulating slowly, as though it were breathing. They reached for the handle. It was cold, slick with something wet. Click. The door did not open. Instead, a low, growling hum filled the tunnel, and the whispers grew louder, closer. There was something on the other side, something waiting. But the door did not open. It didn't need to. The thing on the other side had already found them. The door creaked as if in protest, its wooden surface groaning under the weight of something ancient. But it opened, slowly, impossibly, revealing a vast cavernous space beyond. The air that rushed in from the room was thick, heavy, and carried an eerie, cold chill. They stepped forward, heart pounding, and the moment they did, the door slammed shut behind them, the echo ringing in their ears. Inside, the space stretched far beyond what seemed possible. The walls, high and towering, were covered in symbols, ancient, intricate carvings that seemed to shift, moving beneath their gaze. The lines twisted and turned, patterns that felt alive, that drew their eyes and held them in a trance. The glow that filled the room was faint, almost unreal, pale bluish light that made the shadows around them feel darker, deeper, as though they existed just beyond the edge of reality. They hesitated, but something compelled them forward. The whispers, their name, beckoned from the corners of the room, like tendrils pulling them in. As they moved deeper into the space, the air grew thick with presence. Then they saw them. Figures, ghostly apparitions, pale and translucent, materialized from the darkness, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke. Some of them were bent over in silent sobs, their faces twisted in sorrow, while others stood tall, their mouths open in screams that never reached their ears. And then they turned. The figures pointed, each one, with a trembling finger, pointed directly at the character. Their eyes, empty and hollow, seemed to burn with an accusing intensity. Silent words, filled with fury and pain, passed from their mouths. They were blaming them. They stepped back, a cold sweat breaking out on their skin. What did they want? Why were they here? The whispers grew louder, more frantic, weaving in and out of the air, as though the very walls were alive, humming with the voices of those who had been trapped here before them. Their name was on every breath. It echoed, sharper now, closer. Then something shifted. The figures, those that had pointed, those that had cried, flickered and blurred, becoming indistinct, like they were being pulled back into the shadows. But their gaze never left them. A memory, their own, surfaced, unbidden. They could feel it, something they had tried to forget, tried to bury. It was deep within them, rising like a flood, overwhelming their senses. The memory was vague at first, distorted by the haze of time, but it grew clearer. A name, a place, a time, a dark secret from their family's past, a pact, a curse. They had been a part of it. They had helped to bring it into being, to make it real. The bloodline was marked, tied to something older, something dangerous. And now it was coming back. The figures around them grew still, their eyes fixed, not with anger anymore, but with something else, sadness, an unspoken understanding, as if they knew what the character had done, as if they knew the truth that had been buried for so long. And in that moment, they understood. They had been trapped here long before they had ever stepped through the door. This was their fate, their destiny, woven into the very fabric of their being. And the door was locked. A low rumble echoed through the chamber. and the walls seemed to breathe in time with the whispers. The voices called their name louder now, shrieking, screaming, demanding. They turned frantic, searching for a way out. But the space was endless, and the whispers were too loud now, too close, too familiar. The walls pulsed with an energy that wasn't human, an ancient force that was alive and awake, wrapping around them like a noose. They were trapped. And as the whispering reached its crescendo, as the walls seemed to close in, one single piercing thought struck them. There was no way out. The darkness swallowed them whole. It was so thick, so absolute, that it felt as though the very air had been suffocated, leaving only a void. They couldn't see their hands in front of their face. They couldn't hear anything but the rush of their own breathing, and yet something was there. Something waiting. They tried to move, to push forward. But the ground was wrong. It was sticky, pulling at their feet, as though the earth itself was alive, reaching up to hold them, to trap them. Every step was like wading through something thick, like struggling through tar. With each attempt to free themselves, the ground tugged harder, pulling them deeper into its grip. The whispers were there too, louder now, closer. At first they were soft, like the wind rustling the leaves. But now they were distinct, clear voices, all accusing, all blaming. You did this. You brought it upon us. You were part of it. Their heart raced. Their pulse thundered in their ears, but they couldn't escape the words. The voices twisted, overlapping in a cacophony of rage, sorrow, and despair. You did this. You caused the curse. You knew all along. It was as though the darkness was pressing against them, suffocating them with the weight of their own guilt. The words felt too real, too familiar. They began to doubt themselves, to question the very memories that had once seemed so clear. Was it all just a trick? Had they always known? Their legs buckled beneath them. The sticky ground held them, the whispers crushing their spirit. They tried to block it out, but it was impossible. It was everywhere now, in the head, in their heart. It felt as though their mind was starting to fracture, unraveling with every breath. The shadows around them seemed to shift, forming a shape, a figure. Tall and indistinct at first, like a patch of darkness in the shape of a person. The figure slowly emerged from the void, its edges curling in on themselves, like a shadow made flesh. And then it spoke. You remember me, don't you? The voice was chilling, familiar and distant, like a memory that refused to stay buried. The figure stepped closer, and in the dim glow of the oppressive darkness, the character could just make out the outline of its face. It wasn't human, but it was familiar. A face twisted by time and regret. A ghost from their past, someone they thought they had forgotten. You can end this, the figure said. It spoke calmly, almost soothingly, but the words were a lie. You can end it all right now, but it comes at a price. The figure's eyes glowed, an unnatural, unsettling light, like fire burning in the dark. You've always known what you had to do, haven't you? They wanted to run. They wanted to scream, to escape this nightmare, but their body refused to move, paralyzed by the weight of the choice the figure now presented. Stay and suffer forever, the figure whispered. Its voice was soft like a caress, like the end of all things. Stay here in the dark, in the shadows, where time has no meaning, or ... It paused, as if savoring the moment. Or you can do something terrible, something unimaginable. The figure stepped forward, close enough now that the character could feel the cold, the chill of its presence. It reached out, its hand like a claw. The curse can be broken, but not without a price. You have the power to end it. All you have to do is make the choice. The character's heart was hammering now, faster than ever before. They had no choice, no way out. The walls were closing in, the voices grew louder, and the figure stood before them, offering a twisted form of salvation. The weight of the decision crushed them. There was no escape. Not from the curse, not from the figure, and certainly not from themselves. They were trapped, stuck in this endless void of their own making. And in the silence that followed, only the sound of the figure's final words remained. Make your choice. And the character realized, in the deepest part of their being, that they had always known. Always. But the cost of freedom would be far worse than anything they had ever imagined. The weight of the memories came crashing down all at once. There was no warning, no gentle unraveling of the past. Only a sudden, overwhelming rush of truth. The whispers were no longer distant murmurs. They were clear now. A single voice, cold and accusing, speaking directly into their mind. The figure, standing before them, faded into the background as their memories surged forward like a tidal wave, pushing everything else aside. They remembered everything. It was their family all along. A generation of secrets, of dark promises made in the dead of night. A deal. Their ancestors had made a pact. A terrible bargain with something ancient. Something far beyond the realm of human understanding. The price had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the final moment to claim what was owed. It had always been a part of them, running through their blood, a darkness that had been passed down through generations. And now, it was their turn. They were the final piece, the last sacrifice, the one that would complete the curse. Their bloodline was tied to this thing, this demon, and it had been patiently waiting for them to come of age. They had always been destined for this, destined to fulfill the price that had been promised so many years ago. The ground beneath them shifted, groaning like it was alive, like it was awakening. The shadows pressed closer, their form now unmistakable. A figure, a spirit, or perhaps something worse. It was at the heart of the curse, the source of the torment that had been passed down through their family for centuries. Its form was ever shifting, a mass of dark tendrils and broken, twisted faces. It spoke, its voice an echo of everything they had feared. You remember now, don't you? All that has been lost, all that was promised. It didn't need to say more. The truth was in the air, thick and suffocating, like the very essence of evil had become embedded in the fabric of this place. It had always been there, waiting, watching, feeding off the despair that had been passed down through the generations. The figure extended a hand, its finger sharp and long, stretching toward them. You have the power to end this, it said, its voice like the scratching of claws on stone. You are the final sacrifice. You are the one who can break the curse. The offer was clear. Freedom, release from the torment, the end of the darkness that had haunted their family for centuries. But there was always a catch. I will free you, the figure continued, but in exchange, you must give up everything, your soul, your humanity. You will belong to me forever. The character felt the weight of the decision settle on their shoulders like a boulder. The voices, the whispers, the figure's cold gaze. It was all so overwhelming, so crushing, to be free of this place, free of the curse, but at what cost? They looked into the figure's eyes, those dark, endless eyes, and the truth hit them with a force they couldn't ignore. The curse had never been about them. It had always been about power. The kind of power that came from binding a soul, from trapping it in eternal servitude. The demon didn't care about them, didn't care about their freedom. It cared about what they could give it. And it was their choice. The figure waited, its dark presence heavy, suffocating. The whispers rose, becoming deafening, like a tidal wave of voices calling their name, urging them to make the decision. They could feel the power pressing down on them, urging them to bow, to accept the offer. But the cost was everything. A single step forward, a single word, a single choice. The figure's smile twisted, its dark lips curling into a mocking grin. Make your choice. And as the character stood there, torn between the life they could reclaim and the soul they would lose, they realized the truth. There was no way to escape. The darkness had already claimed them. The deal had already been sealed. They just didn't know it yet. The chapter ended, leaving the choice hanging in the air, like a knife poised above their heart. What would they do? Would they accept freedom at the cost of their soul? Or would they remain trapped, fighting against the very fate that had been set for them long ago? The answer, it seemed, would never come. At least not yet. The cold air outside the forest was a welcome relief, but it didn't soothe the raw, terrified pulse in the character's chest. They had fled, ran as fast as they could, breaking through the trees. The dark figures that had stalked them still burning in their mind. The whispers had followed them, fading into the distance, but their presence lingered like a phantom, never truly gone. They stumbled through the underbrush, every crack of a twig, every rustling of leaves making them jump. The moonlight, once a beacon of clarity, now seemed to mock them, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The forest was behind them, but its grip was still very much on them. When they finally reached the clearing, the old house loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark against the pale sky. The door was still there, still ajar, just as they had left it, but stepping inside felt wrong now. There was a chill in the air, something far colder than the night outside. The warmth of the house had vanished, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating cold. The walls felt closer, the ceilings lower. Everything was the same, yet everything had changed. They closed the door behind them, the sound of the latch clicking far too loud in the silence. The house felt like a place abandoned by time, a place that had never truly been theirs. They glanced around. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The furniture, the walls, even the windows, where moonlight now poured in like pale liquid, seemed untouched, but it was the feeling that gripped them. It was as though the house was watching, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They walked through the rooms, moving from one to the other as if they were on autopilot, trying to shake the feeling that the shadows were alive, that they were waiting for them to make a mistake. They found their way to the kitchen, where everything was exactly as it had been. The cabinets, the old wooden table, the sink with its chipped enamel, but there was no comfort in it anymore, no safety. The house no longer felt like a refuge. The silence in the air was more suffocating than the storm outside ever could be. Then they went upstairs. The bedroom was the same too, but it felt colder. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as though the house itself was absorbing the terror that still clung to their skin. They went to the bed where the doll had once sat, its empty eyes staring at them. But the doll was gone. Gone. They hadn't seen it since the night they had left. At first, they breathed a sigh of relief, thankful that the thing that had haunted them was no longer in the room. But then they noticed something else. The feeling, the sense that they were being watched was stronger than ever. Their heart began to race, and the air grew colder still. The whispers were faint, just on the edge of their hearing. But they were there, lurking just beyond the grasp of understanding. The house groaned, the walls creaking, as if someone, was moving within it. The footsteps that had echoed upstairs before now sounded closer. And the whispers, those incessant whispers, grew louder, more urgent. They turned, eyes scanning the room. Nothing, except for the mirror. The same mirror they had seen every day, its silver frame gleaming softly in the low light. They stared into it, looking at their reflection, their haggard face staring back at them, pale, haunted, exhausted. But something was wrong. A shadow. At first, they thought it was their own. Maybe their eyes were playing tricks on them. Just a trick of the light. But no. It was moving, shifting, standing. It was behind them. A tall, dark figure, its shape hard to define, but unmistakably there. It didn't make a sound. It didn't move except to loom closer, its presence suffocating. The figure had no features, no eyes, no face. Only an overwhelming sense of dread, of cold, infinite darkness that seemed to stretch into eternity. They froze, the blood draining from their face. They knew it wasn't just the remnants of their fear. This was real. This thing, this shadow, had followed them back. They slowly turned around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty bedroom, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. Their breath came in shallow gasps. They spun back to the mirror, searching, but the shadow was gone. The reflection was just them. No dark figure, no looming presence. But the feeling never left. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The whispers began again, louder this time, circling around them like a whirlwind. They had escaped the forest, but the forest had never truly let them go. The shadow would always be there. As they backed away from the mirror, they couldn't shake the image of that figure standing right behind them. Their minds screamed at them to leave, to get out. But the door was locked, and the house, this house, felt like it had closed in on them, trapping them inside with whatever dark force still haunted it. And then, just as they turned toward the door, ready to flee, a soft, chilling voice echoed in their mind, "You can never leave." The shadow had returned. It was waiting. As the whispers grew louder, the figure's presence seemed to solidify, stretching its dark tendrils across every corner of the room. The air was thick with the feeling that no matter how far they ran, how hard they tried to escape, this place, the curse, would never let them go. The door, once a symbol of freedom, now stood closed, an unyielding barrier that kept them in the house, in the grip of something far worse than they had ever imagined. The shadow in the mirror, the cold, suffocating air, everything was now a part of their reality. The character stood frozen, heart pounding, waiting for the final, inevitable truth to come crashing down. But then, in a surreal, almost haunting moment of clarity, everything stilled. The shadows stopped moving. The whispers quieted. The reflection in the mirror remained silent. And just as the darkness seemed to swallow everything whole, the screen flickered. A bright light shone from somewhere unseen. The character took a breath, the terror still alive in their chest, as the image in the mirror wavered and distorted. And then, in bold letters across the screen, the message appeared. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The end.